The train doors opened, and in that single moment, Eleanor Hart's future cracked in two. She stood frozen on the platform, breath caught somewhere between hope and dread, staring at the man who was supposed to be her husband. He did not rush toward her. He did not smile or call her name. He simply stood there, still as stone, eyes fixed on her with a look she could not yet understand. Something was wrong. Eleanor felt it deep in her bones before her mind could name it. This was not how it was meant to begin. She had crossed half a country for a promise of stability, of partnership, of survival. Instead, silence wrapped around her like a tightening rope. And as the wind swept across the platform, Eleanor realized she was about to learn whether love could exist without a single spoken word. The Dakota Plains did not care why people came. In the spring of 1887, they only cared whether you were strong enough to stay. Eleanor Hart knew that truth well. At 27, she had already buried her parents, watched the family boarding house collapse under unpaid debts, and worn out her welcome with relatives who had their own mouths to feed. When the letter arrived, plain handwriting, careful sentences, practical promises, it felt less like romance and more like a lifeline. Standing at a Gravesend station, Eleanor clutched her worn valise and the letter she had memorized line by line. Sincerely, Thomas Reed, always that signature. No affection, no tenderness, just sincerity. At the time, it felt honest. "You meetin' your male husband?" the station agent asked, chewing on a straw. "Yes," Eleanor replied, lifting her chin. "Mr. Reed." "Risky business," he muttered. Man could be anyone. The train hissed to a stop before she could answer. Passengers spilled out, families, merchants, young lovers clinging to one another. Eleanor scanned every face, heart pounding. Then she saw him. Thomas Reed stepped down last. Tall, broad. His coat was patched, his boots worn, his dark hair in need of trimming. He carried one battered trunk with effortless strength. But it was his face that stopped her breath. Not handsome exactly, though there was something compelling there. Weathered. Serious, but utterly still. No greeting, no smile. They locked eyes across the platform. He approached, set down his trunk, removed his hat, and looked at her. "Mr. Reed?" Eleanor asked softly. "I'm Eleanor Hart." He nodded. She waited. The silence stretched, heavy and public. "Are you not going to say anything?" Thomas's jaw tightened. Slowly, deliberately, he reached into his coat and pulled out a small notebook. He turned it toward her. "I cannot speak." Eleanor felt the ground tilt beneath her feet. Eleanor read the sentence again, as if the words might rearrange themselves into something else. "I cannot speak." Her throat tightened. "You mean temporarily?" she asked, grasping for reason. "An illness? An injury?" Thomas shook his head. His expression held no drama, only a tired honesty. He wrote again, faster now. "Born this way. I can hear. I can read and write. I should have told you. I was afraid you wouldn't come." The platform seemed to sway. Around them, curiosity gathered, like dust in the wind, townsfolk, pretending not to stare while staring all the same. Eleanor felt every eye on her back, waiting to see what kind of woman she would be. "You should have told me," she said quietly. Not accusing, just true. Thomas nodded. He wrote one last line and held it out with steady hands. "If you wish to leave, I will pay for your return ticket." It would have been easy. One step back onto the train, one polite explanation. A clean escape from a future she had never imagined. Eleanor turned slightly and saw the station agent watching openly now. Judgment already forming on his face. She could hear the whispers before they began. She turned back to Thomas and looked at him properly for the first time. His hands were scarred and strong. His clothes were clean, carefully mended. The notebook he held was worn thin at the edges, like something precious used sparingly. And in his eyes, those storm gray eyes, was a familiar weariness. The look of a man already braced for rejection. He expects me to walk away, Eleanor realized. And the truth was, part of her wanted to, but want had nothing to do with survival. She had no money left, no family willing to take her in, no respectable work waiting back east, and beyond all of that, there was something else, something quieter. Thomas had given her a choice. He had not trapped her. He had not hidden the truth until it was too late. Most men would have. Eleanor drew in a slow breath. "I came here for a partner," she said, steadying her voice. "Someone willing to build a life, not recite poetry. Can you still offer that?" Thomas's eyes widened. He nodded once, firm and unmistakable. "Then I'll stay," Eleanor said. For a moment he simply stared at her, as if unsure he had understood correctly. Then he reached out and shook her hand. His grip was warm, solid, real. "No more secrets," Eleanor added. Thomas nodded again, Something in his expression softened. Not quite a smile, but close. As they walked away from the platform together, Eleanor heard the first whisper rise behind them. She did not turn around. She had made her choice. Whatever came next, she would face it head on. And she had the unsettling feeling that everything was about to change. The wagon ride to Thomas Reed's farm stretched longer than Eleanor expected. Not in distance, but in weight. The prairie rolled endlessly around them, grass bending beneath the spring wind, the sky vast and indifferent. Thomas drove with quiet focus, reins steady in his hands, eyes reading the land as if it were a familiar language. Eleanor sat beside him, her thoughts loud in the silence. She tried twice to speak, then stopped herself. Painfully aware that conversation now moved in only one direction, the quiet pressed in on her chest. "I'll have to learn," she said finally, frustration slipping into her voice, "to stop expecting answers." Thomas glanced at her, one corner of his mouth lifted, just barely, before he looked back to the road. "It's not amusing," Eleanor added, then winced at her sharpness. "This is going to be difficult." The hint of humor faded from his eyes. He nodded once, serious now, and Eleanor felt a stab of guilt. Difficulty was not hers alone. When the farm finally appeared, her shoulders loosened despite herself. The house was plain but solid, weathered wood and a wide porch that promised shade in summer. A barn stood nearby, a chicken coop beyond it. 2 horses grazing calmly in a small corral. Fields lay prepared for planting, furrows straight and patient. "It's nice," Eleanor said honestly. She had expected far worse. Thomas helped her down from the wagon, his hand steady at her waist, lingering just long enough to make her acutely aware of how close they stood. Then he stepped back, collected their belongings, and led her inside. The interior surprised her even more. Clean floors, simple sturdy furniture, curtains at the windows, dishes washed and stacked, a pot of stew warmed over the fire, bread set out neatly. On the table sat a small jar holding a handful of wild prairie flowers. Eleanor swallowed hard. Thomas handed her his notebook. "You must be tired and hungry. Your room is there. I'll sleep in the barn until after the wedding. The ceremony is Saturday. 3 days. Enough time to change your mind. You're giving me an escape," she said softly. He nodded. She shook her head. "I keep my word, Mr. Reed." He hesitated, then wrote again. "Call me Thomas, and thank you." That night, alone in a narrow but clean bedroom, Eleanor lay awake listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the plains. Wind through grass, distant coyotes, silence layered with meaning. She thought of the flowers on the table, the careful order of the house, the way Thomas had offered her freedom when he could have demanded commitment. She did not know what kind of marriage this would be, but she knew it would not be careless. The next 3 days passed in a strange, suspended rhythm. As if time itself was holding its breath, Eleanor threw herself into the work of the farm, partly out of necessity and partly to keep her mind from circling the same fearful questions. She fed the chickens at dawn, gathered eggs with careful hands, learned which horse startled easily and which leaned into touch like an old friend. Thomas worked from first light until the sky darkened, never idle, never rushed. He repaired fencing, turned soil, checked tools, and when Eleanor asked questions, he answered patiently, sometimes with quick notes in his notebook, sometimes with exaggerated gestures that made her laugh despite herself. Slowly, without realizing it, she began to feel useful again. She learned things about him in fragments. He had come west alone, saved every coin to buy this land, and trusted work more than luck. His silence had not made him fragile. It had made him deliberate. Every movement carried intention. On Friday evening, Eleanor sat on the porch steps, watching the sun bleed orange and gold across the prairie. Thomas joined her, sitting close enough that she could feel his warmth without being touched. For a long while, they simply existed together. Then he handed her the notebook. "Are you afraid of tomorrow?" "Yes," she admitted after a moment. "Aren't you?" Thomas nodded. He wrote again. "I'm afraid I won't be enough." Eleanor looked at him, really looked, at the strength in his shoulders, the quiet steadiness in his gaze. "I'm afraid of the same thing," she said softly. "That this will be lonely." He considered that, then wrote, "Then we are equally afraid. That seems fair." She smiled. It surprised her how much comfort that gave. Saturday dawned clear and warm. Eleanor dressed in her green dress, worn but clean, and pinned her hair with careful hands. The small church was simple and white, filled with a handful of curious and well-meaning onlookers. When the pastor asked Thomas to speak his vows, the silence felt heavier than ever. Eleanor stepped forward. "My husband has written his vows," she said calmly. May they be read? The pastor hesitated, then nodded. The words were simple, honest, promises of protection, partnership, and action where words failed. Eleanor's eyes burned as she listened. When it was her turn, she spoke clearly, looking only at Thomas. I promise to stand beside you, she said, to listen in every way that matters, to build a life with you in truth. When the pastor pronounced them husband and wife, Thomas leaned in carefully, giving her time to pull away. Eleanor did not. The kiss was gentle, brief, and full of possibility. As they walked out together, Eleanor knew one thing with certainty. This was no longer just survival. It was the beginning of something real. Married life did not announce itself with grand changes. It arrived quietly, in the space between morning chores and evening light, in the awkwardness of two people learning how to share silence. The first week passed in small discoveries. Thomas rose before dawn, moving through the house like a shadow so as not to wake her. He drank his coffee black and strong, kept a meticulous ledger of every expense, and repaired anything broken rather than replacing it. What surprised Eleanor most was how loud the quiet felt. She found herself talking simply to fill the space. I've named the brown hen Henrietta, she announced one morning. She lays better when spoken to. Thomas looked up from his bowl, eyes crinkling at the corners. He wrote, The chickens appreciate a woman's presence. They were lonely with just me. Were you lonely? The question slipped out before she could stop it. His pen paused, then, Yes, but I learned to live with it. You shouldn't have had to, Eleanor said softly. Life settled into a rhythm. Eleanor managed the house, baked bread, mended clothes. Thomas worked the land with quiet determination. He was an excellent farmer, reading the sky and soil like a book. But nights were the hardest. They lay side by side in the darkness, careful not to touch, aware of one another in ways neither quite understood. 2 weeks after the wedding, Eleanor went into town alone for supplies. Mrs. Calder, the general store owner, greeted her loudly. Must be terribly quiet out there, she said with a smile that wasn't quite kind. My husband listens better than any man I've known, Eleanor replied evenly. Outside, a woman named Maylene approached her. Your husband fixed my wagon wheel once, she said. Wouldn't take payment. He's a good man. Then a young woman, Emma, shyly admitted that Thomas had once stood between her and some cruel boys until they left. He didn't need words, she said. He just stayed. Eleanor drove home lighter than she'd left. That evening, she found Thomas in the barn. We need to talk, she said. About us? He nodded, attentive. I don't want us to be strangers sharing a house, she continued. I want to understand you. Ask me anything, he wrote. She asked about his mother, who taught him to write. About his father, who turned away. About why he chose a mail-order marriage. At least this way, he wrote, you knew what I could offer. Eleanor took his hand. I'd like to build something real. Thomas met her gaze and wrote, I would like that too. And in that moment, the silence between them felt less empty and more like possibility. Spring deepened, and with it came work that left little room for doubt. Eleanor learned the farm the way one learned a new language. Slowly, through repetition and patience. She kept a small notebook now, mirroring Thomas's, filling it with observations about soil, weather, and planting cycles. He taught her everything he knew, writing careful explanations while she asked endless questions. You're a patient teacher, she told him one morning. Thomas wrote, I had to learn patience early. It stays with you. She discovered she had a talent for it. Numbers made sense to her, and patterns emerged where once she'd seen only dirt and uncertainty. Thomas noticed. His quiet pride showed in the way his eyes softened. When she grasped something quickly, evenings became something close to ritual. They sat on the porch bench Thomas had built, watching the sky burn itself out over the plains. Sometimes Eleanor read aloud from the few books he owned. He carved small figures from scrap wood, birds, flowers, shapes that felt like feelings given form. One evening she asked, Do you ever wish you could speak? Thomas thought for a long time before writing. Sometimes, when I want to tell you things quickly, when I want to shout at foolish men, but mostly, no. Silence taught me to listen. Eleanor considered that. You listen better than anyone, she said. The heat came early that year. One afternoon, Eleanor found Thomas swaying in the kitchen, his face flushed and unfocused. Panic sliced through her. You're overheated, she said, forcing him into a chair. She cooled him, watched him carefully, stayed by his side until his breathing steadied. When he finally recovered, his hand found hers, squeezing weakly. Not used to being cared for, he wrote later. Well, you are now, Eleanor replied firmly. That night, lying beside him, she realized something had shifted. Concern had become attachment. Respect had softened into something warmer. She cared, deeply, and that truth both frightened and steadied her. Days later, sitting on the porch, Eleanor finally spoke what had been pressing on her heart. This marriage, it's become more than an arrangement for me. Thomas's pen moved slowly. It has for me, too. He hesitated, then wrote again. I don't have words for what I feel. You don't need them, Eleanor said, her voice quiet but sure. He reached out then, tentative, and cupped her cheek. The touch held a question. Eleanor answered by leaning into his hand. The silence between them changed shape, no longer empty, no longer uncertain. It was full. Summer settled over the prairie with relentless heat, turning the land brittle and the air heavy. Eleanor learned quickly to rise early, working beside Thomas in the cool hours before the sun grew cruel. By midday, even the chickens sought shade, and the world seemed to hold its breath. It was on one of those blistering afternoons that everything nearly unraveled. Eleanor was kneading bread when Thomas came in from the fields far earlier than usual. One look at his face, too red, too drawn, sent a chill through her. He swayed slightly, reaching for the table. Thomas, she said sharply, dropping the dough. Sit now. His hands shook as he tried to pull out his notebook, but she stopped him. No writing. You're overheated. She guided him to a chair, forced water into his hands, pressed cool cloths to his neck and forehead. His skin burned beneath her touch. Fear wrapped tight around her chest. You could have died out there, she whispered. Anger and terror tangled together. You don't get to do that anymore. Not now. Thomas's eyes opened fully then, focusing on her with effort. He reached for her hand, holding it weakly, as if anchoring himself. She stayed beside him for hours, talking constantly just to keep him awake. When his color finally returned and his breathing evened out, she sank back, exhausted and shaken. Later, when he could write again, his message was unsteady. I'm sorry, I forget sometimes that someone would mind if I didn't come back. Eleanor swallowed hard. I mind, she said firmly. More than you know. He asked her to stay until he slept. She lay beside him, careful, their fingers laced together. In the quiet of that dim room, Eleanor understood something she could no longer deny. She was falling in love with him. That evening, after he had fully recovered, the air between them felt charged. On the porch, Eleanor finally said what could no longer be held back. I need to know where we stand, she said softly. I can't keep guessing. Thomas wrote for a long time. When he turned the notebook toward her, her heart thudded painfully. This stopped being an arrangement weeks ago. I think about you constantly. I'm afraid of wanting too much. Eleanor covered his hand with hers. Then we're afraid together. He reached for her face, slower this time, surer. When he kissed her, it was gentle, searching. And Eleanor felt warmth bloom through her chest. This was no longer duty. This was choice. When they finally pulled apart, she rested her forehead against his. That was worth waiting for, she murmured. Thomas smiled fully then, and in that smile Eleanor saw certainty. Whatever lay ahead, heat, hardship, doubt, they would meet it side by side. After that night, something fundamental settled into place. The farm did not change. The work did not ease. But Eleanor and Thomas moved differently within it, as if an invisible thread now tied them together. Touch became natural, his hand at the small of her back as he passed, her fingers brushing his arm when she handed him tools. Small gestures, constant and reassuring. They did not rush. Desire existed, yes, but it was tempered by care. Thomas never assumed. Every closeness asked permission, and each time Eleanor answered, it felt like choosing him all over again. Evenings became their own kind of courtship. Eleanor read aloud while Thomas carved, the scrape of his knife steady and soothing. She watched his hands shape wood the way he shaped everything else, with patience and intention. One night she asked, "What's your favorite?" He thought, then wrote, "Whitman. He finds holiness in ordinary things." "Read me your favorite," she said, then caught herself. Sorry." Thomas was already pointing to a passage. She read it aloud, her voice slow and careful. When she looked up, his gaze was fixed on her, intense. "Because," he wrote, "people like me are told we are broken. But he says the body itself is sacred." Eleanor reached for him without thinking. "You're not broken," she said fiercely. "You never were." He touched her cheek, tentative but sure. The moment stretched, heavy with feeling. Then he leaned in, kissing her softly. Eleanor's breath caught. This kiss deepened, warmer, more certain than the last. "I want this," she whispered against his mouth. "I want you." Thomas paused, searching her face, making sure. Then he nodded. That night silence became its own language. There were no words to stumble over, no expectations to perform, only touch, patience, and a gentleness that made Eleanor's chest ache. Thomas moved as if listening to her body the way he listened to everything else. And Eleanor, who had braced herself for duty, found instead connection, real and grounding. Afterward, they lay tangled together, amazed. Thomas reached for his notebook. That was my first time. Eleanor lifted her head. Mine wasn't, she said honestly, then softened. But it was the first time it felt like this. He wrote again. I waited for someone who saw me. She kissed him slow and reverent. I'm glad you waited. Sleep found them wrapped together, the prairie night breathing around the house. When Eleanor woke before dawn, she felt something new settle in her chest. Peace. This marriage, born of necessity and fear, had become something chosen. And chosen love, she realized, carried a strength she had never known before. By late summer, the land grew anxious. The sky withheld rain, the wind ran hot, and the corn stood tall but thirsty in the south field. Eleanor watched Thomas check the windmill twice each day, his movements precise, his jaw set with worry. She had learned enough now to read the signs alongside him. It will hold, she said one evening, trying to lend her certainty to his. You planned for this. Thomas nodded, though his eyes stayed on the horizon. He wrote later that night, if the rain doesn't come soon, we'll lose half the crop. They waited together, and when the storm finally arrived, it came with violence, thunder splitting the sky, rain lashing the house, wind bending the fields until Eleanor feared they would snap. They ran to the barn, then the chicken coop, mud sucking at their boots. Thomas found Henrietta and her chicks huddled and alive. Eleanor laughed and cried all at once, pressing her face into his shoulder as the rain eased. At dawn, they walked the fields. Damage, yes, but survival too. The irrigation had held. Most of the crop would make it. Relief barely had time to settle before trouble arrived in town. They went in for supplies a week later, the wagon heavy with need. Near the store, a large man stepped into their path. His posture practiced and superior. Reed, he said curtly. Heard you planted 20 acres of corn. Fool's gamble. Eleanor stiffened. She recognized him by reputation alone, Calvin Brooks, owner of the largest farm in the county. Thomas stood calmly, reaching for his notebook. Brooks waved it away. No need. Farming isn't done with scribbles. You'll ruin prices when you fail. And that, Eleanor said clearly, stepping forward, is enough. Brooks turned, surprised to find her there. This is men's work, Mrs. Reed. My husband knows this land, Eleanor replied. He prepared the soil for years, chose drought-resistant seed, built irrigation with his own hands. Brooks scoffed. You expect me to believe? Yes, she cut in. Because I've learned it myself. Because I keep the records. Because I know the yields. She opened her notebook, calm and precise, and laid out the facts. Around them, people slowed, listened. Brooks's confidence faltered. You're an uppity woman, he muttered. I'm a partner, Eleanor said evenly. And I won't let you diminish him because he doesn't shout. Thomas touched her arm, a grounding presence. His eyes shone, not with anger, but pride. They left without another word. On the road home, Thomas stopped the wagon. He wrote with shaking hands, No one has ever defended me like that. Eleanor took his hand. No one ever should have needed to. But I will. Every time. He leaned in and kissed her, gratitude and love bound together. And Eleanor knew the land was not the only thing they were cultivating. They were claiming their place. The heat finally broke in early autumn, leaving the fields ripe and heavy with promise. Harvest came hard and fast, long days that left Eleanor's hands aching and Thomas's shoulders stiff with fatigue. They worked side by side, speaking little, understanding everything. When the last rows were cleared and the grain stored safely, they stood together at the field's edge, watching the sun sink low. We did it, Eleanor said softly. Our first harvest. Thomas pulled her close, resting his forehead against hers. No words were needed. Pride lived in the way he held her, steady and sure. The peace did not last. One afternoon, a column of smoke rose on the far horizon. Thomas saw it first, his body going taut. He was already harnessing the horses before Eleanor reached him. That's Brooks's land, she said. The big barn. Fire traveled faster than thought. When they arrived, the barn was already engulfed. Flames roaring like something alive. Neighbors formed bucket lines, shouting orders, but panic ruled. Horses screamed inside the structure. Thomas jumped down and ran toward the blaze. Thomas, wait! Eleanor shouted, terror tearing from her chest. He didn't. He disappeared into smoke and heat. Emerging moments later with a frantic horse, then another. Someone took the reins, but Thomas turned back again. No, Eleanor cried, grabbing his arm. Please. He met her eyes, fierce and resolute. Then he was gone. The roof groaned. Flames climbed. Eleanor stood frozen, breath locked in her throat, every second an eternity. When Thomas finally stumbled out, soot blackened and coughing, carrying a box of barn kittens and dragging a limping dog, Eleanor broke. She ran to him sobbing. "You could have died. I can't lose you." Thomas held her tightly, shaking. Later, when he could write, his words were careful. "I didn't think my life mattered as much." Eleanor cupped his face. "It matters to me. You matter to me. That means everything." When the fire was finally out, Calvin Brooks approached them. His voice was rough with smoke and something like humility. "You saved my animals," he said. "After how I treated you." Thomas wrote simply, "Because it was right." Brooks read it twice, then held out his hand. "I was wrong about you." Thomas took it. That night, driving home beneath a sky scraped clean by fire and wind, Eleanor rested her hand over Thomas's heart, feeling its steady beat. "You're not expendable," she said quietly. "Not to me. Not ever again." Thomas stopped the wagon, turned to her, and wrote with trembling honesty, "I believe you, and I will try to believe it about myself." They kissed there on the empty road, smoke still clinging to their clothes. Gratitude and fear and love tangled together. And Eleanor knew, whatever trials remained, they would face them as one. Winter came early, laying a quiet hush over the plains. Snow softened the land, closing roads and shrinking the world to the small circle of their farm. Eleanor welcomed the stillness at first, until her body began to change in ways she could not ignore. The exhaustion, the nausea that struck in the mornings, the days slipping past without her monthly cycle returning. She stood at the window one pale morning, hand resting over her stomach, heart racing. When Thomas came in from the cold, she turned before fear could steal her courage. "I need to tell you something." He stilled at once, eyes fixed on her face. "I think I'm fairly certain I'm with child." For a long moment, Thomas didn't move. Then the notebook slipped from his hand and hit the floor. His eyes filled wide and shining, shock and wonder crashing together. He picked it up with shaking fingers. "A baby ours?" Eleanor nodded. "We'll see the doctor to be sure." When the doctor confirmed it days later, Thomas wept openly, holding Eleanor as if afraid she might vanish. He wrote later that night, "I never thought I would be allowed something this good." "You didn't take it," Eleanor said firmly. "We built it together." Winter deepened. Thomas became her shadow, careful and attentive, bringing her warm tea, taking over chores without complaint. When influenza swept through town and struck Eleanor hard, he rode through a blizzard to fetch the doctor, then stayed awake for days tending her, tracking her fever, refusing rest until she was safe. When the fever finally broke, Eleanor woke to find him asleep in a chair beside her bed, his head resting near her hand. She touched his hair gently and his eyes flew open. "I'm all right," she whispered. "We're all right." Relief collapsed through him. He wrote with shaking hands, "I would ride through anything for you." "I know," she said softly, "and I love you for it." Spring crept back slowly, and with it came anticipation and fear. Eleanor's body grew heavy with new life. Thomas built a cradle with his own hands, sanding it smooth, carving small roses along the edge. When he gave it to her, Eleanor wept without shame. Their daughter arrived on a warm May night, crying strong and fierce. Thomas held her like a miracle, tears streaming as she wrapped her tiny fingers around his scarred thumb. They named her Rose, as Thomas sat beside the bed, one hand on Eleanor, the other on their child. He wrote a single line and turned it toward her. "I am not silent anymore." And Eleanor understood exactly what he meant. Life after Rose's birth did not slow, it deepened. The days blurred into a rhythm of feeding, rocking, tending the house, and stealing sleep whenever it was offered. Their once quiet home now held new sounds, soft cries, small breaths, the gentle creak of the cradle Thomas had made with his own hands. Eleanor had never known exhaustion like this, but she had also never known such fullness. Thomas proved to be a natural father. He woke at the slightest sound, took Rose from Eleanor's arms with instinctive care, and walked the floors with her pressed against his chest, humming soundlessly the way his mother once had for him. Rose calmed almost immediately when held by him, her tiny body trusting without question. "She knows you," Eleanor whispered one night, watching them together. "She listens the way you do." Thomas smiled and wrote later, "She understands more than people think." As the months passed, the town's attitude shifted almost without Eleanor noticing. Neighbors stopped by with bread or warm clothes for the baby. Women who had once whispered now smiled openly. Even Calvin Brooks tipped his hat when he passed their gate. Respect, Eleanor realized, did not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it came quietly, earned over time. One evening near the end of summer, Eleanor sat on the porch bench with Rose asleep against her shoulder. Thomas joined her, settling close, his arm warm around her back. The prairie stretched wide and calm before them, grasses swaying in the evening breeze. "Do you ever think about that first day?" Eleanor asked. "The train, when I nearly left." Thomas nodded slowly. He did not reach for his notebook this time. He simply looked at her, at Rose, at the home they had built. "I'm glad I stayed," Eleanor said. "I thought I needed words, promises, certainty, but what I needed was this." She gestured softly. "Presence, care, someone who listens with his whole being." Thomas kissed her temple, gentle and sure. His response needed no writing. Rose stirred, opening her eyes, those familiar, storm-gray eyes, and gazed between her parents as if studying them both. Eleanor smiled, her heart full to the point of ache. "Our daughter is going to grow up knowing 2 languages, she murmured. "Mine and yours. She'll speak with her voice and listen with her whole soul." Thomas's hand covered Eleanor's, steady and warm. As the sun dipped low and the sky filled with color, Eleanor understood something she would carry forever. Love did not need sound to be real. It did not need eloquence or declarations. It lived in consistency, in hands that showed up, in silence that listened, in actions repeated every day without fail. She had come west seeking survival and found a life richer than anything she had imagined, a husband who spoke through devotion, a child who knew herself safe, a home built not on words but on truth. Eleanor leaned into Thomas, watching the light fade, and smiled. The deepest conversations she had